The title of my talk actually deals with geopolitics in the post-Yugoslav era, but inevitably it is important to go to Yugoslav era to come to the point, and maybe I will just conclude with post-Yugoslav space and geopolitics. So proposition number one is that no communist federation had survived the end of the Cold War. As consequence of the changed and changing state system of a post-Cold War Europe, some 25 new states had emerged. First came the unification. So from two we got one state. But then disintegration of Soviet Union and Yugoslavia followed. First, disintegration of Czechoslovakia followed in two states, very peacefully, no one really noticed. And then the disintegration of Soviet Union and Yugoslavia actually created not almost 20 new states, but they created also a chaos in the existing state system of Europe. So just at the beginning, it seemed that the Soviet Union was going to disintegrate without violence. But then we were not really surprised, but still it was a new challenge for security of Europe when we realized that Russian Federation's policy in its near abroad, post-Soviet neighboring states, are not as secure as we thought. So first we had intervention in Georgia in 2008 and then in Ukraine in 2014, actually suggesting that even the disintegration of Soviet Union is not finished business. Now we turn to disintegration of Yugoslavia that actually led to a series of wars waged between 91 and 99 on the territory of Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Kosovo, and of course Macedonia in 2001, which was internal conflict of unrest. So if we assume that the Cold War was a war, and that in the history, European history, almost every major war ended up in a peace conference at which the leaderships of surviving states sat together to decide on leading principles how to rearrange surviving states and newly formed states, because as Charles Tilly would say, states make the wars and wars make states. Very often, states that started the war would not exist at the end of the war. So it was, and not, third point that is very important to bear is that no Yugoslav war in the last 150 years was a local, regional conflict. Yugoslav or wars on the territory of Yugoslavia were or would become part of greater European wars. And both Yugoslav states were actually products of these post-war international conferences, to mention Versailles and Versailles state system that governed state relationship in Europe was succeeded by Yalta state system from 1945 to 1989, I would say, if we consider Germany, unification of Germany is the first change in this Yalta system. So I would pause here, and I think it's quite important. What then led international community in disintegration process of Yugoslavia and legitimizing the new states? Because although Yugoslav conflict could be still at that time considered as a local European conflict, the presence of international community was very robust, not just robust, it was very important, and it could be divided in pre-war, during the war, and post-war periods with different actors and different combinations of international community leading it. And in the first stage of Yugoslav conflict, which we could, for the purpose of this argument, start with 1991, where it was absolutely obvious that Yugoslavia will not hold together. There was this clash between two principles of self-determination. This is an interesting word. And it led and it was introduced in Versailles. And at that time, it was a revolutionary word that should liberate the nations and allow them to have their own states after centuries of being part of one or another empire, in this case, mostly Habsburg Empire. So there were two principles of that self-determination. One proposed by Serbia, which was called new states, post-Yugoslav states should be based on self-determination of people, meaning that Serbs scattered all over the former Yugoslav republics should be able to continue to live in one state, but not to move in Serbia, but the territories where they lived should be actually carved in this new post-Yugoslav Serbia. This was not accepted by the other republics, certainly not by Croatia, where about 11% of population was Serb, living on mostly on 11 enclaves in the big cities. And Slovenia and Croatia actually proposed principle of self-determination of republics. In other words, acceptance of outside the republican borders, which were established in 1945, so they were called mistakenly communist borders because each of these borders had very long or longer historical tradition, and they got support of international community. And the only leading international principle to confirm this, that new post-Yugoslav states should be formed by acceptance of their internal republican borders, which now, by the Act of Independence, became international borders, was the Badinter Commission opinions. So it was not even a binding document. There were a series of different opinions given by a Robert Badinter Commission that consisted of former constitutional judges of major European states. And this was actually already established in a period from 91 to 92, so one should ask themselves how come that war actually started after these opinions were given, and one international platform that had to decide about post-Yugoslav states was established already in, already in September 91. It was a conference of Yugoslavia that Badinter Commission advised on different unresolved issues, and then it became International Conference for Former Yugoslavia, established in August 92. So there was this international presence, which was a sort of equivalent to what I would call an international peace conference after a major European war that should busy itself with the principles and criteria that would actually legitimize every border. Interesting thing is that the first part of this International Yugoslav Conference, before it got the name ICTY as we know it, dealt with this, and eventually Serb side almost decided it because, then they changed their minds in the last moment because internationals would allow very high level of autonomy of each of the ethnic groups that would be left out within these newly formed borders. And that would apply also for Croatian Serbs, or Serbs living in Croatia. They would get a special status, but Milosevic refused the whole conference and concept of this, the Hague document because Kosovars would get exactly the same status. So that would actually, and in many documents at the ICTY that we dealt with, and Milosevic archive is wonderful treasure trove about this, we see that Milosevic basically said no to Hague paper, not just because he didn't want to reciprocity in treatment of Serbs in Croatia with treatment of Kosovo Albanians. And this was the end of everything. And after that, we have this general principle that borders of former Yugoslav republics will be recognized, but what followed after that, the war. And this is something that is still very important. So next point that I want to make, from 7 Yugoslav successor states, each single one of them has border issues with each other. So, okay, we have a principle, but de facto, there is a desire, I'm not even saying need, of each of them for border corrections. So if we go back to these 7 successor states and we try to follow their developments, Slovenia and Croatia are the members of European Union, and still they have border issues. Before they became members of EU, Slovenia in 2004, in accession period time, Slovenia had issues with the same issues with border and is accepted as a member of EU. Croatia in 2013 was accepted as a member of EU, but their arbitration process is still not finished to mutual satisfaction. But if we assume that this border dispute will be made actually obsolete by the fact that they will be prosperous EU countries, we can move on and see what are the other border problems and issues they have. Croatia, on the eastern side, has a border problem with each of its neighbors. It has issues with Montenegro and with Serbia on the river Danube, still unresolved to mutual satisfaction. And then when we move to Bosnia, this is an interesting border issue, and I would call here for another look into how and what international community, how it added to quite interesting sovereignty issues. Bosnia and Herzegovina was a country where the war lasted longest period of time. And interestingly, and certainly I would never be aware of it if it were not for ICTY trials, international community never articulated it, but actually it supported 2 principles when constitution of Bosnia and Herzegovina is concerned. One is ethnic separation, and another was ethnic homogenization. And actually, if you think, these are euphemisms for crimes that actually happened in the 90s and in the war in Bosnia, but also in the war in Kosovo. And how and what it happened is that although recognizing outside borders of Bosnia and Herzegovina, before the war started in April 92, before the first bullet was fired, we had the first peace plan, Kutliero plan, that was made known in February 92, and it already ethnically divided Bosnia in 3 separate colors. Green was always for Bosnians, blue for Croats, and red for Serbs. So if you go to Kutliero plan, you would understand that ethnic separation was something that European community, at that time a leader in peace negotiation, accepted. So what followed after each single peace plan for Bosnia and Herzegovina was variation on ethnic separation. And if you read a Bosnian Serb document from May 92 called 6 Strategic Objectives, what is their first strategic objective? Ethnic separation in Bosnia. Only they said it, but Kutliero didn't say it. They always implied that it was a will of the people, while will of the people was one expressed in the referendum in Bosnia at the end of February, where a majority of them, including Bosnian Serbs, were for territorial integrity of Bosnia and Herzegovina. What followed was something worse. So ethnic separation is already a level of inevitability of violence. But what followed is ethnic homogenization that actually was shown the most in the peace plan, Van Solven plan, where assigned cantons for each ethnicity were not, of course, ethnically homogeneous. But Van Solven plan encouraged crimes and encouraged the parties to make each of their assigned cantons ethnically homogeneous. And the places where, in this process of ethnic homogenization, the areas where the crimes were most severe were actually areas where you would not have one ethnic group, in this case Serbia, but you needed this area for territorial continuity. And the most flagrant example of this is Eastern Bosnia. You did not have there any significant majority or presence of Serbs. The vast majority was Bosnian Muslims, and the crimes there were more severe. So from there on, you could see another very important thread in formation of Bosnia as a state, and this is a growing Islamophobia in the international community, which to my huge surprise showed as evidence. We were absolutely not expecting it, but very high-level witnesses would tell us, and I'm talking about chef de cabinet of Tudjman, we are talking about the last Prime Minister of Yugoslavia, Ante Marković, told us that yes, the meeting between Slobodan Milošević, Franjo Tudjman did take place in Karađorđevo in March '91, that they did talk about carving territories of Bosnia and Herzegovina, leaving small parts of territory to Bosnian Muslims, but that the international community gave them a green light for this. And if you look into these general plans for Karađorđevo, and if you look at Kutliero plan, that you could see actually reality corresponding. Only Milošević and some his advisors confirmed that they ever talked about it, but the international community, our political representatives, never told us what they were actually doing. So we had to go and reconstruct the reality. The fact is that from all 7 former Yugoslav states, each of them came out of the war more ethnically homogeneous than before the war. But 2 of these 7 post-Yugoslav countries, they were now almost permanently internally divided, territorially divided, are those that the international community considers that they have Muslim majority. And Republika Srpska is not some sort of sequence of unfortunate incidents. The internal division of Bosnia and Herzegovina was in a way okayed, and there was a green light from international community to have it that way. Kosovo, there was absolutely no need in Kosovo, to my knowledge, to make this artificial border between north and south. The north of Kosovo, especially after the Kosovo War, and this border now has been one of the important ways how to negotiate the status of Kosovo between Kosovo and Serbia. And the transitional narrative of the ICTY, which can I have my second slide? Would show us, yes, oh, where is it? Yeah. The transitional narrative of the wars in former Yugoslavia, according to Tribunal and certainly to Milošević's case, where you could see Serbian plans, shows that criminality starts with goal 3, when Serbs carved Republika Srpska Krajina borders, followed by same pattern of Republika Srpska. And basically, if you think of Serbian municipalities in the north, you see actually similar patterns, that you claim territories based on majority. In post-transitional period, Serbia was very active, actually criticizing tribunals' narrative as anti-Serb narrative, while tribunals actually in judgments of tribunal very lenient towards Serbia. If you look at the crimes in Croatia, if you look at the crimes and gravity of the crimes in Bosnia and Herzegovina, no official from Serbia has been found guilty of any of these crimes. ICTY finished its transitional narrative about Serbs' involvement in Croatia with indicting generals of JNA, which is Yugoslavia, okay, de facto maybe Serbian, for Dubrovnik, and for Republika Srpska Krajina, 2 local leaders, Milan Babic and Milan Martic. Šešelj was acquitted, for example. Milosevic's judgment didn't come out. In Bosnia, if you tell people that for Bosnia and for genocide, there was no legal way through joint criminal enterprise or any other way that you can read in the judgments that would connect Bosnian perpetrators, not Karadzic so much because he was a politician, but all others were, but some military commanders who were directly paid by Belgrade and were members of that Yugoslav army, they were not linked by any way to Serbia. And yet, Serbia still criticized tribunal, and in post-transitional narrative, they found the way to redirect attention and start using the national and international legal system in place to issue indictments against Croats, but mostly Bosnian Muslims, politicians, and military, so that now in this post-transitional space we have much grayer story, but and in the same time, what I find fascinating, when I used to come in the 2000-something to Kosovo and Bosnia, we would tell them, please use tribunal judgments and archives, because you now have to use it to cement your real history of the war. And you know what the answer was? The whole world knows that we are victims. And we told them, no, the world is not going to write your history. So they were so reluctant even to capture and put on paper and put on record that what tribunal delivered them. And in transitional justice and in post-transitional justice, they were actually passive. And Serbia was very, very active. And why was Serbia active? Because its strategic narrative is to readdress its territorial goals from pre-war and war period, wait a little bit for this, what Daniel Server was saying, changes in balance of power in the world, and actually goes and expands its borders just for maybe a little bit of territory, so that they, in the history books, can say Serbia did not lose the war, any of the wars, and we did made and enlarged Serbia's post-Yugoslav borders. Thank you.